Olivia Green never sought attention. As a cleaner in one of the most prestigious office buildings in the city, she was accustomed to blending into the background, unnoticed by the powerful figures who walked the halls. She found comfort in the humdrum of daily routine, the solitude of dusting empty offices, and the rhythmic swish of her mop as it scraped across polished floors. It was a quiet existence, far from the chaotic world of wealth and power that seemed to suffocate the upper echelons of society. But that morning, everything changed. It was an ordinary Tuesday, or so Olivia thought. She was working in one of the building's corner offices, an expansive space with glass windows that overlooked the city. The office belonged to Alexander Grant, the CEO of Grant Enterprises, a man whose face she had seen in the newspapers on more than one occasion. A man who had everything: wealth, influence, power. He was one of the city's most powerful business figures, yet to Olivia, he was just another name in the endless sea of people who passed through the building each day. As she swept the floor near his desk, Olivia heard a sudden thud. She spun around, her heart skipping a beat. Alexander Grant was slumped over his desk, his face pale, and his hand resting limply on a pile of paperwork. For a moment, Olivia froze, unsure of what she was seeing. Her mind struggled to process the sight of the man who had everything now reduced to a lifeless figure in front of her. Panic gripped her chest. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. It was weak, barely there. She knew she had to act fast. Without thinking, she dialed emergency services, her voice shaking as she relayed the situation. But even as she spoke, she knew that time was running out. His breathing was shallow, each exhale quieter than the last. Olivia's instincts kicked in. She remembered the first aid training she had taken years ago. She placed her hands on his chest, steadying her breath as she began CPR. It felt like hours, though it could have been mere minutes. Every second stretched on, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had no choice. When the paramedics finally arrived, they rushed to take over, their movements precise and swift. Olivia stepped back, feeling a wave of exhaustion crash over her. She watched as they worked on Alexander, doing everything they could to stabilize him. The paramedic in charge gave her a quick nod of approval before turning back to his patient. He was still alive. Hours later, when Alexander regained consciousness in the hospital, he was disoriented and weak. The first thing he saw was Olivia, sitting quietly by his bedside, her gaze fixed on the floor. She hadn't expected to be there. She had simply done what she could, and then she had left. The fact that she had saved his life felt like a distant, impossible thing. One of those moments where you help and then move on. But Alexander had other ideas. When he finally opened his eyes, confusion flooded his features. But there was a glimmer of something more, something like recognition. He glanced at the woman beside him, trying to place her face. Her quiet demeanor seemed oddly familiar, though he was certain they had never met. She was just a cleaner, wasn't she? Yet, there was something about her that kept drawing his attention. He noticed the pendant she wore around her neck, a delicate silver piece with a small, intricate design. Nothing remarkable at first glance, yet something about it seemed important, deeply personal. "Who are you?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from the strain of the attack. Olivia blinked in surprise, then stood quickly, trying to make herself small, trying to fade into the background once more. "I'm just the cleaner, sir. I'm glad you're all right." His eyes never left the pendant. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible thing, but the moment his gaze fixed on it, he froze. His breath caught in his chest. He hadn't seen it in years, but the sight of that pendant, the design so strikingly familiar, made his heart lurch. It was an exact replica of one he had given to his wife, Victoria, all those years ago, just before she had died in that tragic accident. "Where did you get that?" His voice was more forceful now, a sharp edge to it that Olivia hadn't expected. She had no idea why it had struck such a nerve, but she could see the intensity in his eyes. There was something in the way he looked at her, a mix of disbelief and something else, something darker. My mother gave it to me," Olivia replied, fidgeting with the chain as she tugged it slightly, as though trying to hide it. "It was hers before she passed away." Alexander leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. Your mother? He repeated. Who was she? Olivia felt a twinge of unease. She had never been one to talk about her past, to dig into the memories of her childhood. She wasn't sure why she was even explaining herself to a man she barely knew. But there was something about Alexander, something desperate in his voice, in the way he clung to that pendant as though it were a lifeline. I don't know much about my mother, Olivia continued, her voice softer now. I was adopted when I was very young. My mother, she gave me the pendant before she died. Alexander's mind raced. The pieces didn't fit. Could this woman be connected to Victoria somehow? Could she be a relative, perhaps? The idea seemed impossible, but the pendant, it was too much of a coincidence. He had to know more. His thoughts were already moving faster than he could keep up with them. But first, he needed to see her again, to ask more questions. I need to speak with you, he said abruptly. Tomorrow, please. I have to understand more about this. Olivia nodded, her heart beating in her throat. She had no idea what this would mean, what kind of trouble she might be walking into. But something about his plea, the urgency in his eyes, made her agree without hesitation. This encounter, this strange twist of fate, was just beginning, and neither of them knew how deep the mystery ran. The next morning, Olivia arrived at Alexander Grant's office with a sense of trepidation she couldn't shake. The heavy doors of the building felt like they were closing in on her as she made her way through the gleaming halls, her footsteps echoing in the silent air. She had agreed to meet Alexander again, but what had she gotten herself into? She had no idea what he truly wanted, or why he seemed so fixated on a simple pendant, one that had been passed down from her late mother. As she entered the luxurious office suite, Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The space was stunning. Vast windows flooded the room with natural light, and sleek, modern furniture gleamed in shades of polished wood and chrome. It was the kind of office that belonged to someone who had everything, yet somehow, it felt empty. The walls were adorned with expensive paintings, each one a symbol of wealth and taste. But none of it could fill the space where Olivia had been called to meet a man who was nothing like the world he inhabited. Olivia! Alexander's voice broke through her thoughts. His presence seemed to fill the room, his tall frame standing by the large wooden desk, his hands folded in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but there was a palpable tension in the air. He gestured to the chair in front of him. Please have a seat. Olivia hesitated, her palms clammy. She had never been one for such opulence, never had a reason to be in places like this. She sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She looked up at Alexander, his piercing blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he was searching for something deeper. It was as if he saw something in her that no one else did, a connection, a thread linking her to a past she barely understood. I don't know what you want from me, Mr. Grant, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. I'm just a cleaner. I saved your life, yes, but that's all there is to it. I don't know why you're asking about my mother and this pendant. Alexander's gaze softened, though the intensity didn't wane. He moved to the desk and picked up a framed photograph, holding it out to her. Olivia took the picture hesitantly. It was a photo of a woman, her mother, no doubt about it. But she hadn't seen this image before. The woman in the photograph, though older, had a striking resemblance to Olivia. Her mother, Amelia. This, Alexander began, his voice slow, measured, is my late wife, Victoria. She died 25 years ago in a tragic accident. This pendant, he paused, glancing down at the silver replica hanging around Olivia's neck, was something I gave her, a symbol of my love for her. Olivia felt her throat tighten. Victoria's name echoed in her mind, but it was like a dream she couldn't quite grasp. She had seen the woman in a few photographs growing up, but her mother had never spoken much about her past, especially about the man who had given her the pendant. I'm sorry, Olivia said, trying to steady her emotions. I don't know what this has to do with me. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made Olivia feel exposed. Olivia, there's something you need to understand, he said softly. I don't believe in coincidences. There's no way you could have this pendant unless there's a connection between you and Victoria. I need you to tell me everything you know about your mother. Your adoption. Who was she, really? Olivia felt a wave of nausea rise in her chest. She had never dug into her past, had never been interested in uncovering the truth about the woman who had raised her. Her adoption records were incomplete, and her mother had always been secretive about where she came from. Amelia had passed away when Olivia was only 15, and after her mother's death, there had been no one to ask. The details of her origins had always been a blur. But now, sitting in front of Alexander, with his unwavering gaze and the pendant hanging around her neck, Olivia couldn't ignore the truth any longer. There was something more here, something hidden. I don't know much, she said, her voice shaking. My mother didn't tell me much about where she came from. She was mysterious. I know she was adopted herself, but she never told me anything beyond that. She said she was from a small town, but she never talked about her past. The only thing she ever gave me was this pendant. She touched it gently, her fingers brushing over the cool metal. She always said it was a family heirloom. Alexander's eyes flickered with recognition, though it was fleeting. A family heirloom, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He stood up, pacing slowly in front of her. This is more than just a pendant, Olivia. This piece is part of a much larger puzzle. I have reason to believe that your mother, Amelia, was somehow connected to Victoria's death, and that, in turn, might mean you're connected to everything that happened all those years ago. Olivia felt a chill run through her. What are you saying? My mother had nothing to do with Victoria's death. She couldn't have. Alexander stopped pacing and faced her directly. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. I've spent years trying to piece together the truth about Victoria's death, and now, with this pendant, it feels like I'm getting closer. There are things I've uncovered, suspicious events, strange coincidences, and they all lead me to believe that your mother was more involved in that tragic accident than anyone realized. For the first time, Olivia felt the weight of the situation settle in. She had always lived in the shadow of her mother's silence, her own past a mystery that was too uncomfortable to face. But now, Alexander Grant, the very man whose wife had died in that accident, was looking to her for answers. I don't know if I can help you, she said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. I don't know what happened back then, but I'll help you look. I'll help you find out whatever we can. Alexander's eyes softened for a moment, a look of gratitude flashing across his face. Thank you, Olivia. I promise, we'll get to the bottom of this. Together. As Olivia left his office that morning, her heart was heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The investigation into her mother's past, and its possible connection to Victoria's death, had only just begun, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was something far darker and more tangled than either of them could have imagined. The days following Olivia's meeting with Alexander were a blur of uncertainty and questions. The heavy burden of the secrets she had long buried now seemed to haunt every waking moment. As she walked through her modest apartment, the pendant around her neck felt like a weight, a constant reminder that she was no longer just the quiet cleaner she had always been. She was now tied to a mystery far larger than anything she could have ever imagined, a mystery that reached deep into her past. That afternoon, Alexander called again, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Olivia, we need to go to the adoption agency. It's time to uncover the truth about your origins. The decision to follow him was one she hadn't taken lightly. She had never been interested in investigating her past before, always feeling that some things were better left untouched. But now, as her connection to Victoria Grant's death seemed to grow more apparent with each passing day, she couldn't ignore the pull to understand the truth. Who was her mother really? Why had Amelia kept so many secrets from her? And, more importantly, what did it all have to do with the pendant? The adoption agency they visited was nothing like the high-rise buildings Olivia was used to. It was tucked away on a quiet street, nestled between aging buildings and shaded by large oak trees. The small sign on the door read, Hope's Reach Adoption Agency, and its modest appearance was in stark contrast to the grand offices Olivia had recently encountered. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, and the walls were lined with filing cabinets that seemed to stretch on forever. A woman in her late 40s sat behind a cluttered desk, her glasses perched at the tip of her nose as she flipped through a file. Her name, as she introduced herself, was Linda. She greeted Alexander and Olivia with a polite but distant smile, her eyes briefly lingering on Olivia as though calculating something. "I understand you're looking for records related to a past adoption?" Linda asked, her voice soft but efficient. Alexander stepped forward, his expression all business. "Yes. Olivia here was adopted many years ago. We're looking for any records or information you may have about her mother." "Her name was Amelia Green." Linda looked up at the mention of the name, her brows furrowing slightly. "Amelia Green," she murmured, as though the name sounded familiar, but not in a way that would prompt immediate recognition. "Let me see what I can find." She opened a filing cabinet, pulling out a few dusty folders, her movements deliberate and careful. As she flipped through the papers, Olivia could feel a knot of tension forming in her stomach. She had never known her mother's origins, and even now, the thought of uncovering more was both terrifying and strangely liberating. "Here it is," Linda said, finally pulling out a file that seemed to have been hidden away for years. She handed it to Olivia with a quiet sigh, as though the contents of the file were something she had not expected. Olivia's hands trembled as she took the file. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding as she scanned the papers. There were adoption records, but they were incomplete. The dates, the names, even the signatures, all seemed to be missing crucial details. There was no explanation for why this file was so sparse, but Olivia couldn't ignore the sense that it had been intentionally altered. "This isn't right," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's so much missing." Alexander stood beside her, looking over her shoulder at the documents. His face darkened as he noted the same gaps and inconsistencies. "This doesn't make sense. Why would they leave so many things out? And why doesn't Amelia's background seem to be included at all?" Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly aware of the weight of the questions that had been raised. "I'm not sure. These are the only records we have on file. It's possible that some documents were lost over the years, or perhaps they were never properly filled out. Sometimes, adoptions can be complicated, especially when they involve sensitive situations." The unease in Linda's voice was palpable. She seemed hesitant, as though she knew more than she was willing to say. Olivia's curiosity piqued, but before she could press further, Alexander stepped in, his voice firm. "We need to know if there are any other records, anything that might explain why Amelia's past is so hidden. Can you check the archive files or contact the agency's previous staff?" Linda hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously between them. After a long moment, she sighed, as though she had made up her mind. "I'll see what I can do. But I warn you, sometimes the truth is buried for a reason." Olivia looked at Alexander, her heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. Whatever was hidden in these records, it was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. But why? And what did it have to do with her mother's mysterious death? "Thank you," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the unease in the air. "We'll be waiting." Later that night, as Olivia lay in bed, the weight of the day settled heavily on her chest. The incomplete records, the cryptic warnings, and the nagging feeling that there was something far darker hiding in her mother's past. All of it swirled in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. She had spent most of her life not questioning her origins, but now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, she couldn't turn away. The next day, they returned to the agency, where Linda handed them a small, sealed envelope. "I found something," she said quietly, her voice tinged with apprehension. "It's not much, but it might help. You'll have to read it for yourself." With trembling hands, Olivia opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten, faded, and sealed with wax. It was addressed to Amelia Green, and as Olivia read, her heart sank. The letter spoke of a hidden arrangement, a mysterious connection between Amelia and someone named Victor Sinclair. The name struck Olivia like a bolt of lightning. Victor Sinclair was a name she had heard only in passing, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. He was a man of power, someone whose influence was known throughout the city. But what was his connection to her mother? And why had this letter been hidden away for so many years? As the implications of the letter settled over Olivia, she realized that the answers she sought were much closer than she had imagined. She was no longer just a bystander in the story of her mother's life. She was an active participant, and the truth, however dark it might be, was something she had to uncover, no matter the cost. The air in Alexander Grant's office was thick with an uneasy tension as Olivia held the letter from the adoption agency. Her fingers trembled as she folded the paper back into its envelope. The name, Victor Sinclair, felt like a jagged edge against her thoughts, a puzzle piece she hadn't known she was missing. She could sense that this was only the beginning. There was more to her mother's past than she could have ever imagined, and it was pulling her deeper into a world of secrets and lies that she wasn't ready to confront. Victor Sinclair, Alexander's voice cut through the quiet hum of the room. His expression was unreadable, his eyes clouded with thoughts he hadn't yet shared. I knew a Victor Sinclair. He was involved in some of the city's wealthiest deals. Powerful, influential. But there's no record of him having any connection to your mother, Olivia. This doesn't add up. Olivia looked at him, her heart racing. Who is he? Why was my mother involved with him? Alexander rubbed his temples, deep in thought. That's what I need to find out. I've spent years trying to piece together the circumstances surrounding my wife Victoria's death. But now, this letter changes everything. Victor Sinclair. If your mother was involved with him, then it's possible she knew something. Something important. The mystery was growing more tangled by the minute, but Olivia was determined to see it through. She couldn't afford to ignore the truth any longer. We need to find out more about this Victor Sinclair, she said, her voice firm. There has to be a reason he's connected to my mother, and to everything that happened. I agree, Alexander replied, his voice colder now, as if the pieces of a puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But finding out the truth means stepping into dangerous territory. Sinclair's family isn't the type to welcome strangers poking around their business. You'll have to be careful. Olivia nodded, feeling the weight of his warning settle in her chest. She didn't have the luxury of backing out now. If she was going to get the answers she needed, she had no choice but to move forward. Later that afternoon, Olivia and Alexander traveled to the Sinclair estate, a sprawling mansion nestled in the outskirts of the city. The building itself exuded wealth and power, its stone walls and towering windows a stark contrast to the more modest buildings Olivia had grown up with. The gates, high and imposing, were adorned with the Sinclair family crest, a symbol of old money and influence. The mansion stood like a fortress, an intimidating reminder of the legacy it represented. As they approached the entrance, Olivia's stomach churned. She had never been in a place like this before. The house felt oppressive, a silent reminder of the dark secrets it held within. When they were ushered inside, Olivia immediately felt the weight of the Sinclair family's history pressing down on her. The marble floors gleamed underfoot, and the chandeliers overhead cast a soft, golden light across the room. But the beauty of it all was overshadowed by the unease that clung to the air. She had to fight the urge to step back, to turn and run away from the haunting feeling that the answers she sought were buried deep within these walls. A tall man, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, met them in the grand foyer. His sharp features were cold, and his eyes held an edge of suspicion as they met Olivia's. "You must be Alexander Grant," the man said, his voice as smooth as silk. "I'm Jared Sinclair. I'm afraid you've caught me at a busy time, but I'm happy to entertain a visit. What brings you to my home?" Alexander extended a hand, his gaze unwavering. "We need to talk. It's about your late brother, Victor Sinclair." At the mention of his brother's name, Jared's expression shifted, the faintest flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before he masked it with a smile. "Victor," he repeated, as if savoring the name. "I haven't thought about him in years." Olivia could feel the tension in the room thickening, as though the air itself was holding its breath. She stayed silent, watching as Jared led them further into the mansion. She had never been a part of this world, but she could tell that Jared Sinclair was a man who carried his secrets close to his chest. There was something in the way he moved, in the coldness of his smile, that made her stomach tighten. As they sat in a large, opulent sitting room, with walls lined with expensive artwork and rare antiques, Olivia tried to steady her nerves. She had to be strong now. She couldn't let Jared's presence unnerve her. Jared poured them all a drink, offering a glass of aged whiskey to Alexander before turning to Olivia. He studied her with a mixture of curiosity and mild disdain, as though she were an inconvenience rather than a person. "So, what exactly is it that you want to know?" Jared asked, settling into an armchair across from them. "I'm looking for information on Victor Sinclair's death," Alexander began, his voice even but tinged with an underlying intensity. "We believe it may be connected to certain events that happened years ago, and it seems your family might have more answers than you've let on." Jared leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly on the armrest. Victor's death was a tragic accident. A man of his wealth, his power. Things happen. He was reckless, living on the edge. That's just the way of it. I'm sure you understand. Olivia's eyes narrowed. She knew better than to believe that story. There was something off about Jared's response, something rehearsed. He was hiding something. She could feel it. "We have reason to believe that Victor's death was not as accidental as you claim," Alexander pressed, his voice growing more insistent. "And it's tied to a woman named Amelia Green." Jared's eyes flashed briefly, a flicker of recognition that was too quick to miss. But then, just as swiftly, it disappeared behind a veil of indifference. "Amelia Green," he echoed, his voice flat. "I don't know anything about her." But Olivia could see through the lie. Jared knew more than he was letting on. She could feel it in the tension that now hung in the room like a storm cloud. "You're lying," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "You know something about her. You know something about my mother." Jared's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "You're wasting your time, Olivia," he said, his voice cold. "There's nothing more to uncover. Let it go." But Olivia was no longer afraid. She had spent her entire life in the shadows of other people's secrets, but now she was stepping into the light. And she wasn't about to let Jared Sinclair, or anyone else, stop her from finding the truth. As they left the Sinclair estate, Alexander turned to Olivia, his expression grave. "Jared is hiding something. He knows more than he's admitting. We'll need to dig deeper." Olivia nodded, her resolve hardening. There was no turning back now. She had come too far to stop. The drive back from the Sinclair estate was a silent one. The tension between Olivia and Alexander was palpable, both of them weighed down by the cryptic conversations with Jared Sinclair. Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking beneath the surface, something far more sinister than what either of them had anticipated. Jared's dismissive attitude, his attempt to brush off any questions about Amelia Green. She knew that he was hiding something crucial. As they neared Alexander's mansion, the city skyline looming in the distance, Alexander broke the silence. His voice was low but filled with determination. "We're not going to get answers from Jared anytime soon. He's too protective of his family's reputation. But that doesn't mean we can't find another way in." Olivia's mind raced. She had spent the last few days wrestling with the reality of her mother's past, the questions about her origins, and now, Victor Sinclair's death. But despite her fear and the growing weight of the mystery, she knew there was no turning back. She had to keep going. She had to understand the truth about her mother, about Victor Sinclair, and about what happened all those years ago. "Do you have any idea where to start?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. Alexander's lips tightened. "I think we need to go deeper. We need to dig into the past, not just through the Sinclair family, but through the people who were closest to them. If there's one thing I've learned in this business, it's that nothing is ever truly buried." "Someone knows something?" Olivia nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Who do we talk to?" Alexander's eyes flickered with a plan forming in his mind. There was a private investigator hired shortly before Victor's accident. His name is Alan Harris. He's a former cop turned investigator. If there's anyone who knows what happened in those days leading up to the accident, it's him. The name Alan Harris stirred something inside Olivia. It was the first solid lead they had received in days. But finding him wouldn't be easy. Private investigators were often elusive, working under the radar to avoid unwanted attention. But Olivia wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The next day, Alexander and Olivia traveled to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a place that seemed to be frozen in time. The houses were old, with ivy creeping up their sides and faded shutters that had long since lost their original color. Alan Harris's office was a small, nondescript building tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. The sign above the door simply read, Harris Investigations. Inside, the office was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of old paper and leather. A lone fan hummed lazily overhead, and the walls were lined with filing cabinets, each one filled with the weight of countless cases, each one more tangled than the last. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s, his graying hair matched by the weathered lines on his face. His eyes were sharp, though calculating, always watching, as if he never stopped being on the job. "You must be Alexander Grant," the man said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "And this must be Olivia. I've heard about you too. Quite the pair, digging into old graves." Alexander wasted no time. "We need to know about Victor Sinclair's death. We were told you investigated it at the time." Harris didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't seem surprised by the request. He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Have a seat. You're not the first to ask about Sinclair, and you won't be the last. But the things I know, they come with a price." Olivia sat down, her heart racing. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. If anyone could shed light on the mystery of Victor Sinclair's death and her mother's connection to it, it was Alan Harris. "I'll pay whatever it takes," Alexander said, his voice firm. "We need answers." Harris leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. He didn't speak immediately, as though weighing his options. Finally, he sighed, his gaze shifting between Olivia and Alexander. "I don't do this for the money. I do it because some people need to know the truth, whether they're ready for it or not." He reached under his desk and pulled out a folder. It was thick, filled with pages of handwritten notes and photographs. Harris handed it over to Alexander, who took it with a steady hand. "Victor Sinclair wasn't just some wealthy businessman," Harris said, his voice dropping lower. "He was a man with a lot of enemies, and he made more than a few deals that were less than legal. I was hired to keep tabs on him, to find out what he was really up to before his accident, and what I found wasn't pretty." Olivia leaned forward, eager to hear more. "What did you find?" Harris flipped through the folder, pulling out a few grainy photographs and laying them on the desk. The images were old, faded, but they showed a man, Victor Sinclair, engaged in a series of clandestine meetings with several individuals Olivia didn't recognize. In one photo, Sinclair was shaking hands with a man dressed in a suit, his face obscured by shadows. In another, he was in a heated discussion with someone who looked familiar, Jared Sinclair. "These meetings were taking place in the weeks leading up to his death," Harris continued. "Victor was nervous. He knew something was coming. And the people he was dealing with? They weren't the kind of people you want to cross. But the most interesting part of my investigation wasn't what I found about Victor. It was what I found about your mother, Olivia." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. "My mother?" Harris nodded. "Amelia Green. She was involved in some way with Victor Sinclair. She wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was a key player in something much bigger. And I think she knew that Victor's life was in danger long before the accident happened." He flipped through the folder again, this time pulling out a single sheet of paper. A handwritten note, the ink smudged in places as if it had been hurriedly written. It was addressed to Amelia Green. "This note," Harris said, sliding it across the desk to Olivia, "was found in one of Victor's personal files. It was written just days before his death. It doesn't say much, but it's enough to connect the dots." Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she read the note aloud. "I know what you're planning. It's too late to back out now. You're involved in this whether you like it or not. If you try to escape, they will come for you, and they will make sure you never see the light of day again." The words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning sinking deep into Olivia's chest. Her mother had been involved in something far darker than she had ever known, and now the truth was beginning to unravel before her eyes. Amelia Green hadn't just disappeared. She had been part of a much larger web of deceit, danger, and betrayal. And it wasn't just Victor Sinclair who had been in danger. It was her mother, too. "Do you think my mother was trying to protect me?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris looked at her, his expression unreadable. It's possible. But whatever she knew, it was enough to get her involved in something that went beyond her control. The people she was dealing with were ruthless, and I think they still are. The days following Olivia's discovery in Alan Harris's office felt like a blur. The weight of the note she had read, the implications of her mother's involvement with Victor Sinclair, and the shadowy figures surrounding him loomed over her like a storm on the horizon. She couldn't shake the image of the note, its cryptic warning etched into her mind. If you try to escape, they will come for you. Who were they? And what had her mother gotten involved in that was so dangerous? Olivia had spent the last few days sifting through the evidence, trying to piece together the jumbled fragments of her mother's life. She'd also begun to notice something chilling in her own life, a sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, an unsettling glance from a passerby, the way the same car seemed to appear on the road behind her as she drove to Alexander's mansion. She couldn't be sure if it was paranoia or if someone truly was following her. But either way, she knew one thing. The deeper she dug into the past, the more dangerous it became. Alexander had been working on his own investigation, but his focus was divided. Between the looming threat from Jared Sinclair and his family, and his own private dealings, it was clear that the tension was mounting for him too. The storm was coming, and neither of them could hide from it any longer. It was late one evening when Olivia's fears materialized. She had just returned to her apartment after another long day of sifting through the clues, piecing together the puzzle of her mother's past. The apartment building was quiet, the hallways dimly lit, and the silence only served to heighten her anxiety. As she made her way down the corridor to her door, she thought she heard footsteps behind her. Soft at first, then louder, as if someone was deliberately following her. Olivia quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached her door and fumbled with the keys. But before she could unlock it, a figure stepped into her path, blocking her way. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was tall, wearing a dark coat that obscured most of their features, but Olivia could feel the weight of their gaze on her. Olivia Grant. The voice was cold, calculated, and utterly unfamiliar. "We need to talk." Olivia's heart raced, but she stood her ground, keeping her composure. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they took a step closer, and Olivia instinctively backed away, her hand still gripping the door handle. The stranger's voice was lower now, more menacing. "Your mother wasn't as innocent as you think," the voice said. "And neither are you. You've been digging too deep, Olivia. You've stirred up things that should have stayed buried. And now, you're going to pay for it." Olivia's mind raced. She had been expecting something like this, but hearing the threat spoken aloud sent a chill down her spine. Her hand instinctively reached for her phone in her pocket, but before she could react, the figure moved swiftly, grabbing her wrist with ironclad force. "I wouldn't try that," the stranger warned, his grip tightening painfully. Olivia's mind raced for a plan, but her body was frozen in fear. She knew she had to act quickly, before the situation escalated any further. The man was blocking her way, but there was still a chance to get away. She had to think. In a split second, she slammed her knee into the man's groin, catching him off guard. He grunted in pain, loosening his grip on her wrist. Seizing the opportunity, Olivia wrenched herself free and bolted for the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind her with a force she hadn't known she was capable of. She didn't stop to think, didn't even look back. Her heart was hammering in her chest as she raced down the stairs of the apartment building, her mind screaming for her to escape, to get as far away as possible. She had no idea if the stranger had followed her, but she couldn't afford to wait and find out. The danger had arrived, and it was real. She reached the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and instinctively looked around for safety. The city street was quiet, the lights dim, but the familiar hum of life felt distant, far removed from the chaos swirling inside her. She turned a corner, hoping to lose herself in the winding streets, but as she glanced over her shoulder, she saw the same black car she had noticed following her on the road a few days ago. It was parked a little further down the street, its engine running. Fear gripped her as she quickened her pace. She didn't have much time. The danger was closing in. Back at Alexander's mansion, Olivia was still shaken when she arrived, her thoughts scattered and her mind whirling with the intensity of the confrontation. She had to get to the bottom of this. She couldn't let this go. The people who were threatening her were the same ones who had been involved with her mother's past, with Victor Sinclair's death, and with the shadowy conspiracy that she was now tangled in. Alexander was waiting for her in the library, his back turned as he looked out the window. He didn't turn when Olivia stepped in, but she knew he had been waiting for her. "Olivia," he said, his voice low, his back still to her. "I've been doing some more digging. Jared Sinclair isn't just hiding his brother's death. He's hiding something much bigger. I'm starting to believe that he and others in the Sinclair family are involved in something far darker than we thought." Olivia took a step forward, her hands trembling from the recent encounter. "I know. I just had a run-in with one of them. Someone's been following me." Alexander turned sharply, his eyes narrowing in concern. "What do you mean? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said quickly, though she could feel the weight of the fear in her voice. "But we can't keep ignoring this. They're watching us. They know we're close to the truth, and they won't stop until we're silenced. If we don't act now, they'll make sure we don't get the answers we need." For a long moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the soft rustling of paper as Alexander sifted through the files in front of him. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "We're not backing down. We're going to finish what we started. But from now on, we have to be more careful. They won't stop until we're buried along with their secrets. And if we want to bring them to justice, we'll have to fight like never before." Olivia nodded, her fear now tempered by a new sense of determination. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. The weight of the days that had passed hung heavily between Olivia and Alexander. The danger was no longer a distant threat, something vague and intangible. It had become real, something they could no longer ignore. Someone was determined to silence them, someone with the power to make them disappear. And as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fit together, Olivia couldn't help but feel the crushing certainty that the stakes were higher than she ever could have imagined. The evidence they had uncovered so far was damning. Jared Sinclair's involvement in Victor's death, the mysterious private investigator Alan Harris had uncovered, the cryptic note Olivia had found, and her encounter with the stranger had all pointed to one undeniable truth. The Sinclair family, despite its wealth and status, was tangled in a web of deceit, murder, and betrayal. But there was still one piece missing. One question that kept gnawing at the back of Olivia's mind. Where was her mother? She had found no answers in the files, no traces of Amelia Green's whereabouts, only a lingering sense that the woman who had given birth to her was not the person Olivia had always believed her to be. There were whispers of involvement in things far darker than Olivia was prepared to face, things that could cost her more than just her peace of mind. But now, everything was about to change. It was late into the evening when Alexander returned from one of his business meetings, his face tight with frustration. Olivia had been sitting in the drawing room, her thoughts a tangled mess of worry and determination. She barely looked up as he entered, but her heart raced at the look on his face. Something had shifted. "I think I've found her," Alexander said, his voice low, almost as if he were afraid to speak the words aloud. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "Found who?" she asked, rising from her seat. "Your mother," he replied, walking over to the desk where a stack of papers lay, evidence of the investigation they had been working on. He flipped through them quickly, then stopped at a photograph, a blurry, old image of a woman standing beside Victor Sinclair. The photo was grainy, but the features were unmistakable. The woman had the same eyes as Olivia, the same shape to her jawline, the same wild, untamable hair. Olivia's heart pounded. That's my mother. But how? "Keep looking," Alexander urged. He pointed to another photo, one that was much clearer. The woman, Amelia Green, was standing next to a man Olivia did not recognize. He was tall, wearing a dark suit, and had an air of authority about him. His eyes seemed cold, calculating. But what stood out more than anything else was the look of fear in Amelia's eyes. "Who is he?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. "That's the man from the photos I showed you," Alexander said grimly. "The one who was meeting with Victor Sinclair. His name is Richard Hayes. And he's not just some businessman. He's been involved in illegal dealings for decades: drugs, arms smuggling, human trafficking. And I'm starting to believe that your mother, whether she wanted to or not, was drawn into his world. Olivia's mind raced as she tried to process the information. Her mother, a woman who had seemed so ordinary, had been involved in something so horrifying. How much had she known? Had she been forced into this life, or had she willingly participated? And why had no one ever told Olivia any of this? But as she stared at the photograph of Amelia, standing beside Richard Hayes, something else caught her eye. Another figure in the background, obscured by shadows but unmistakable in its posture and stature. "That's him," Olivia said, pointing to the figure. "That's Jared Sinclair. It's him standing next to Richard Hayes, isn't it?" Alexander leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, it looks like him. And from the looks of things, your mother wasn't the only one caught in their web. Jared was involved, and I think this photo is the key. This could explain everything: Victor's death, your mother's disappearance, and why you're being threatened now." Olivia's hands trembled as she absorbed the full impact of what she was seeing. Jared Sinclair wasn't just a passive bystander in his brother's death. He was part of a larger conspiracy, one that involved not just the Sinclair family but a network of criminals tied to people like Richard Hayes. And her mother had been a part of it. "Jared is lying to us," Olivia whispered, her voice filled with the bitterness of betrayal. "He's been lying to everyone. He knew what happened to Victor, and he knows where my mother is." Alexander's jaw tightened. "And he'll do anything to keep the truth buried. But we have something now, something he can't deny." They sat in silence for a long moment, the gravity of their discovery settling over them. They had uncovered the missing link between Amelia Green, Victor Sinclair, and the dark underworld that had been operating just beneath the surface of their lives. But they were no closer to finding her mother, to bringing the truth to light. Olivia's mind raced. There was one place they hadn't yet looked, one place where the truth might finally reveal itself: the Sinclair estate. The next day, Olivia and Alexander drove out to the Sinclair estate, their hearts heavy with anticipation. The mansion loomed ahead, its imposing structure a constant reminder of the power Jared Sinclair wielded. But this time, they weren't here to play by his rules. They had uncovered his lies, and now they were going to confront him with them. As they entered the estate, Olivia felt an icy chill run down her spine. The house, despite its grandeur, felt suffocating, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jared was nowhere to be seen, but his presence was undeniable, lurking in every corner of the mansion. Olivia and Alexander made their way to the study, where they knew Jared spent most of his time. The heavy mahogany doors opened with a creak, and they stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of life. But the only sound was the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Then, from the shadows, Jared emerged. "I was wondering when you two would show up," he said, his voice cold and detached. "I suppose you've come to accuse me of something else now, haven't you?" Olivia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fury boiling inside her. "You've been lying to us, Jared. You knew exactly what happened to Victor, and you know where my mother is. You've been involved in all of this from the beginning." Jared's eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "You think you know everything? You think you have the answers? You're just like your mother, always digging in places you shouldn't." Olivia's fists clenched. "My mother didn't deserve what happened to her. She didn't deserve to be dragged into your world of lies and betrayal. And I'm not leaving here until I get answers." Jared's face twisted with something darker now, a mix of frustration and fear. "You should have stayed away, Olivia. It's too late now. You don't understand the kind of people you're dealing with. If you think this is just about your mother, you're wrong. There are things far bigger than this, things that go beyond you, beyond me. And if you keep digging, you'll be digging your own grave." Olivia's heart skipped a beat as the gravity of his words hit her. He wasn't just trying to protect himself. He was warning her. But it was too late for warnings. She had come too far to back down now. "Where is she, Jared?" Olivia demanded. "Where is my mother?" Jared's eyes hardened. "You'll never find her. She's gone. And the people who took her, well, They'll make sure you follow her. The truth that had slowly unraveled over the past weeks was now undeniable, yet it felt as if the ground beneath Olivia was constantly shifting. Every answer she uncovered brought more questions, and every lead seemed to raise the stakes higher. The conversation with Jared in the Sinclair estate had only confirmed what Olivia had feared, that not only had her mother been caught in the deadly game of deception and crime, but she herself was now entangled in it too. Her questions had pushed Jared to the edge, and he had threatened her with more than just physical harm. The reality was sinking in. Her mother, Amelia Green, had been involved in something far more dangerous than Olivia had ever imagined. But Olivia wasn't prepared to give up on finding her. Not now, not after everything. She sat in the quiet, dimly lit room of Alexander's apartment, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of a glass. The conversation with Jared had left her more disturbed than she cared to admit. His threats hung in the air like a storm cloud, yet the fire inside Olivia had only grown stronger. She wasn't going to let Jared's manipulation stop her from finding her mother. No, if anything, his words had reignited the determination in her heart. She had come too far to back down. "Are you okay?" Alexander's voice broke through her thoughts. He sat across from her, his face etched with concern. The past few days had been nothing short of a whirlwind, and Olivia could see the toll it was taking on him too. They had both been consumed by this investigation, and the weight of it was starting to show. Olivia forced a small smile, trying to reassure him. "I'm fine. Just thinking about what's next." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "Olivia, we need to be careful. Jared's threats aren't idle. I don't want you to get hurt." Her heart clenched at the concern in his voice. She knew that Alexander cared about her, more than she was ready to admit, and she hated that she was dragging him into this dangerous world. But he had chosen to stand by her, and that meant something. It meant that he wasn't going to let her face this alone. "I know," Olivia said softly, "but I have to find my mother. I can't just let her be lost to me. I need to know the truth. Why she disappeared, what happened to her." "I'll be with you every step of the way," Alexander said firmly. "We'll figure this out together. But we need to be smart. We can't take any unnecessary risks." Olivia nodded, grateful for his support, even as a new plan began to take shape in her mind. They had to get answers, but they couldn't do it the way Jared had expected, blindly, recklessly. They needed to outsmart him. They needed to be careful, precise, and above all, patient. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and hidden files. Olivia and Alexander dug deeper, reaching out to old contacts, pulling strings to uncover anything they could about the mysterious Richard Hayes and the network of criminals Jared was connected to. Every lead seemed to circle back to the Sinclair family, but the closer they got to the heart of the truth, the more elusive it seemed. Yet something began to shift. They started to piece together details that, while seemingly small, were crucial. Amelia Green hadn't disappeared by choice. She hadn't just left Olivia behind. Something had happened to her. A decision, a betrayal, something that had forced her into hiding. And now, Olivia was closing in on the final pieces of the puzzle. One afternoon, as Olivia and Alexander sat in his apartment, sorting through stacks of documents, Olivia received a call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Olivia," the voice said, low and urgent. "It's me, Claire." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Claire? The woman who had once been so close to her mother, the woman who had turned out to be not just a friend but a key part of her mother's past? Olivia could feel the weight of the conversation about to unfold, and she held her breath as she waited for Claire to speak. "I don't have much time," Claire continued, her voice shaky, "but you need to know something. What you've been told about your mother being involved with Richard Hayes and Jared, it's all a lie. Your mother didn't choose this life. She was forced into it, and I can prove it." Olivia's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What happened to her?" "I'll explain everything," Claire said quickly. "Meet me at the old cabin by the lake. I'll be there in an hour. Just make sure no one's following you." The line went dead before Olivia could respond, but her heart was already racing. She knew this could be dangerous. Meeting Claire could put them both in harm's way, but if Claire had the answers, Olivia wasn't going to let fear stand in her way. "Alexander," Olivia said, turning to him. "I need to go," Claire called. "She knows something about my mother. Something important." "I'll go with you," Alexander said, standing up immediately. His eyes were filled with concern. "This doesn't sound safe." Olivia shook her head. "I'll go alone. I don't want to put you at risk. Besides, I have a feeling this is something I need to do on my own." He hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. "Be careful, Olivia. Please." An hour later, Olivia found herself driving along a winding road that led to the old cabin by the lake. The air was cool and crisp, the faint scent of pine trees filling the air. As she parked her car near the cabin, she felt an uneasy knot in her stomach. Every instinct told her to turn back, but she pressed forward, determined to get the answers she so desperately needed. The cabin looked abandoned, its once pristine exterior weathered and worn by time. As Olivia stepped out of the car and walked toward the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, but she pushed the fear down, forcing herself to remain calm. The door creaked open, and Claire stepped into the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "You came," she said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't think you would." "I had to," Olivia said, stepping inside. "You said you had answers." Claire nodded and gestured for Olivia to sit down. "I do, but it's not going to be easy to hear. Your mother, Amelia, wasn't the person you think she was. She didn't just vanish. She was forced into hiding after she found out something about Jared, something that could have destroyed him." Olivia's heart pounded as she listened intently. What did she find out? Claire's eyes flickered to the window, as though checking to see if they were being watched. Jared was involved in Victor Sinclair's death, but he didn't do it alone. Richard Hayes was pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and he had your mother wrapped around his finger. When she found out the truth about what happened to Victor, about the extent of the crimes Jared and Hayes were involved in, she was forced to disappear. She couldn't risk anyone finding out what she knew. Olivia felt a wave of shock wash over her. Her mother had known about the conspiracy all along. She hadn't just been a bystander. She had been a key witness to a much larger story. A story that, if it came to light, could destroy everything. Claire continued, "I've been trying to protect her, Olivia, but there's only so much I can do. If Jared finds out that I've been talking to you, he'll come after both of us." Olivia's mind was spinning. Her mother's disappearance, the dark secrets of the Sinclair family, and the terrifying implications of what Claire was telling her. It was all coming together, piece by piece. "I'll find her," Olivia said, determination hardening her voice. "I won't stop until I do." Claire met her gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Just be careful. Jared is dangerous. You don't know the lengths he's willing to go to protect his secrets." As Olivia stood up to leave, her mind racing with everything Claire had just told her, she knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just about finding her mother. It was about exposing the truth, the real truth, and she would stop at nothing to do it. The confrontation with Claire had changed everything for Olivia. The unsettling truth that her mother, Amelia Green, had been involved in something so dangerous, so deeply entangled with the Sinclair family's dark past, set the stage for what Olivia had to do next. No longer was it just about understanding why her mother had disappeared. It was about exposing the corruption and lies that had cost her mother everything. And to do that, Olivia knew she would have to confront the people who had orchestrated this tragic chain of events. The night was cold, but the fire inside her burned brighter than ever. Olivia could feel it. Her purpose had crystallized. She had always thought that finding her mother would be the end of her journey. But now, it felt like the beginning. And Jared Carter, the man whose betrayal had set everything in motion, would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Olivia drove through the winding streets leading to the Sinclair estate, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every turn of the road seemed to carry the weight of history, of secrets buried deep within these walls. She had spent so many days trying to understand the truth, but now it was time to bring it all to light. No more hiding, no more running. The Sinclair estate loomed ahead, its towering gates glinting under the moonlight. Olivia parked her car at the entrance and walked toward the door with a sense of resolve. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. This was about justice. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way down the long corridors, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. She had been here so many times before, always as a guest, never as someone with the power to challenge the secrets this house held. But tonight, she was different. She wasn't just Olivia Green anymore. She was the daughter of a woman who had been wronged, and she would make sure her mother's story was told. At the end of the hallway, Olivia found Jared in the library, pacing restlessly. His eyes flickered with surprise when he saw her, and a smug smile crossed his face. "Well, well," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "If it isn't the little investigator, digging around in places you don't belong." Olivia took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I know what you did, Jared. I know what you've been hiding." His smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though there was a nervous edge to his voice. "I know about Victor Sinclair," Olivia said, her voice steady but cold. "I know you were involved in his death. I know you've been covering up the truth with Richard Hayes. And I know that my mother, Amelia, was a part of it. She knew what you did, and she tried to expose you. That's why she disappeared." For a moment, there was silence. Jared's eyes narrowed, and Olivia could see the flicker of panic that briefly passed through him. He had always believed he could control everything, that his wealth and influence would protect him from the truth. But now, there was no hiding. Olivia had the power to bring his world crashing down. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Jared spat, his voice suddenly sharp. "My family has been through enough, Olivia. You have no right to." "No right?" Olivia interrupted, her voice rising. "You think you have the right to destroy lives? To kill innocent people and cover it up? My mother didn't just leave me, Jared. You made her disappear. You took her away from me. And now, I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Jared's face twisted with anger. He took a step toward her, his fists clenched. "You don't know anything. You think you can just come in here and ruin everything? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll destroy you, just like I destroyed your mother." Olivia stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she would not back down. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about exposing the truth, about making sure that no one else would suffer the way her mother had. "I'm not afraid of you, Jared," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not leaving until I get the answers I deserve." Jared's anger flared, and in a flash, he lunged at her. But before he could reach her, the door to the library swung open, and Alexander appeared in the doorway, his eyes blazing with fury. "Get away from her!" he shouted, his voice commanding and full of authority. Jared froze for a moment, his eyes flickering with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "And who do you think you are?" he sneered. "You think you can stop me?" Alexander stepped forward, his presence imposing. "I'm someone who will make sure you answer for your crimes. You don't get to hurt Olivia or anyone else anymore." The tension in the room was palpable as the two men locked eyes. For a moment, it seemed like an inevitable confrontation would erupt between them. But then, something shifted. Jared's posture sagged, his anger suddenly replaced with a cold, calculating calm. "I'm not the one you need to worry about," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You really think you can take me down? There's more to this than you realize. Richard Hayes, he's the one who pulls the strings. He's the one who controls everything. You think this is over? It's just beginning." Olivia's stomach twisted at the mention of Hayes's name. She had known that Jared wasn't acting alone, but hearing him say it out loud made everything feel so much more dangerous. This was bigger than she had thought, and if she didn't move fast, she could lose everything. "I don't care who you think is pulling the strings, Jared," Olivia said, her voice firm. "I'm going to bring everything into the light, and if you try to stop me, you'll be the one who loses." Jared sneered at her, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes now. Olivia could see that he realized the walls were closing in on him. He had spent so long controlling the narrative, hiding the truth, but now he was trapped. The lies, the manipulation, the murder, they were all coming to the surface. With a final, venomous glare, Jared turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Olivia and Alexander standing there in the silence. As the night wore on, Olivia sat in the library, her mind racing with everything that had happened. She had confronted Jared, but the real battle was far from over. She needed to confront Richard Hayes. She needed to finish what she had started, for herself, for her mother, and for everyone else who had suffered at the hands of these men. But as she looked over at Alexander, who had been by her side through all of this, she realized one thing. She wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. "I'm going after Hayes," Olivia said, her voice determined. "This ends now." Alexander nodded. "I'm with you. Whatever it takes." The first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, casting soft hues of pink and orange across the sky as Olivia stood on the balcony of the Sinclair estate. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, but her mind was far from the serene beauty of the morning. It had been a long, grueling journey, a journey that had unraveled deep-seated secrets and forced her to confront the darkest aspects of her past. But now, at last, the end was in sight. The storm inside her had settled. What had started as a search for her mother had turned into something much more. It was no longer about simply finding Amelia. It was about reclaiming her own life, putting an end to the lies that had surrounded her family, and standing up for what was right. And now, with Jared Carter's confession and the looming confrontation with Richard Hayes, the final chapter of this tumultuous story was about to unfold. Olivia turned and saw Alexander standing in the doorway, his expression calm but resolute. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, intense confrontations, hidden truths, and the looming threat of danger. But in all of it, one thing had remained constant: his unwavering support. It was something she hadn't expected, but it was the thing that had given her the strength to keep going. "Are you ready?" Alexander asked, his voice soft but steady. Olivia took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was the moment they had both been preparing for, the final showdown. Richard Hayes had been the architect of so much pain, the one who had pulled the strings behind the scenes. But his empire was crumbling, and Olivia was ready to make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. She was determined to make sure that the truth about what happened to her mother was exposed, and that Hayes could never harm anyone again. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm, the resolve clear in her eyes. "It's time to put an end to this." They made their way to the heart of the Sinclair estate, where a final meeting was set to take place. Richard Hayes, the man who had orchestrated so many of the tragic events that had plagued their lives, was waiting. Olivia couldn't help but feel a pang of anger deep in her chest as she thought of all the lives he had ruined, the people he had manipulated, and the grief he had caused. But she knew that confronting him would bring the closure they all needed. The office was large, imposing, its walls lined with expensive art and bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Hayes was sitting at a polished wooden desk, his fingers steepled together in front of him as he regarded them coolly. His sharp eyes glinted with a mixture of amusement and arrogance as he watched them approach. "I'm surprised you two made it this far," Hayes said with a mocking smile. "I thought you would have given up by now, but here you are, still trying to play the hero. How quaint." Olivia's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was it, the moment where all the pieces would finally fall into place. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "You can mock us all you want, Hayes," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "But your time is up. You've been hiding behind your wealth and influence for far too long, manipulating everyone in your path. But now, the truth is coming to light, and there's no way out for you." For a moment, Hayes seemed taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure. His smile faltered as he sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You really think you've won, don't you? That you're somehow going to change everything just by showing up here? You're just a girl playing at something far bigger than you understand." Olivia's resolve only hardened. "No, I understand more than you think," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I understand what you've done, and now, the world will understand too. You can't control everything forever." Hayes leaned forward, his face hardening with anger. "You think you can expose me, Olivia? You have no idea what you're up against. I have connections, power, You're just a pawn in a game you don't even know how to play. Alexander stepped forward, his tone calm but authoritative. Your empire is crumbling, Hayes. The truth about your role in Amelia's disappearance, your involvement in Victor Sinclair's death, and all the lies you've spread to cover your tracks is coming to light. It's too late for you to escape. Your reign of control ends today. Hayes's eyes flickered briefly with something like fear before he regained his composure. He tried to laugh it off, but it was hollow. You think you've won? You think you've uncovered everything? You have no idea who I really am, or what I'm capable of. Olivia's heart pounded as she took another step forward, her eyes unwavering. You're nothing but a coward who hides behind lies and manipulation. You've hurt so many people, Hayes. My mother, Victor Sinclair, and countless others. But today, the truth will be exposed, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. For a moment, the room was silent. Hayes sat there, his expression flickering between anger and disbelief. It was clear that he was beginning to understand the weight of the situation, how much of his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. You're a fool, Hayes spat, his voice full of venom. You think this is over? You think you can just walk away from this unscathed? I'll make sure you regret this. But Olivia wasn't scared anymore. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. The truth is coming, Hayes, and there's no way you can stop it. Your lies will be your undoing. With that, Olivia turned to leave the office, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She knew the battle wasn't over yet, but this was the turning point, the moment when everything changed. As she stepped outside the office, Alexander at her side, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The storm that had raged for so long was finally over. The truth had been exposed, and justice was within reach. Days later, the news spread like wildfire. Richard Hayes was arrested, his empire of lies and corruption crumbling in the face of the overwhelming evidence Olivia and Alexander had uncovered. The police had acted swiftly, and the truth had been broadcast to the world. The people who had been manipulated by Hayes, the families he had destroyed, could finally begin to heal. For Olivia, it was bittersweet. The journey had been long and painful, but in the end, she had reclaimed her mother's memory, uncovered the truth about her family's past, and brought justice to those who had suffered. The road ahead would be difficult. There would always be scars, always be reminders of the pain that had been inflicted. But she had learned one thing. She was stronger than she had ever known. And with Alexander by her side, she knew that they could face anything the future might bring. In the quiet moments that followed, Olivia stood by the window of the Sinclair estate, watching the world outside. She knew there was still much to rebuild, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope, a new beginning on the horizon. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. In the end, after all the pain, loss, and countless days spent seeking the truth, Olivia and Alexander had emerged victorious. The price they paid was heavy, but what they gained was far more valuable than any sacrifice. The truth had been revealed, the villain had been brought to justice, and the secrets that had once seemed destined to remain buried were finally exposed. Olivia stood by the window, the warm sunlight streaming into the room, a sense of peace settling in her heart. The storms had passed, the pain of the past slowly fading, replaced by the promise of hope. She knew life would never be without its challenges, but after everything, she had learned how to rise and keep moving forward. With Alexander by her side, and her own courage and resilience, Olivia had found peace within herself. While the road ahead would not always be easy, she knew that she could face anything, for she had overcome her own darkness, unraveled the mysteries of her past, and emerged stronger than ever. Her journey had not only been about finding her mother, but also about discovering herself. And now, she was no longer the girl lost in shadows, but a woman who stood tall, confident, and ready to face whatever the future held. As Olivia smiled and looked into the distance, she knew this was the moment where a new chapter of her life began. A chapter filled with hope, love, and new opportunities. And in her heart, the truth had finally been set free, along with the beautiful things she and her loved ones would build from here on out. With faith, anything is possible. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this journey. We truly appreciate your time and attention as we shared this story. Your support means the world to us, and we hope you've enjoyed every twist and turn, every moment of suspense and revelation. If you like this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay updated on all our latest content. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions help us keep creating more stories just for you. Thank you once again for being a part of this experience. Until next time, take care and stay tuned for more incredible stories ahead. Like, comment, and subscribe.